4. So we just finished up that somatosensory system, looking from a sensory receptor all the way up to this perceptual level processing in the cortex. So to wrap this up, this sensory part up, we're going to move into talking about nerves. So we've talked about the nervous system way back in Unit 2. We talked about this nervous tissue and we talked about neuroglia. So we looked at these different glial cells, these in the central and peripheral nervous systems. But we haven't actually talked about what a nerve is. So we know what a neuron is, but what is an actual nerve? So nerve is a nerve is a cord-like organ in the peripheral nervous system. Now, in his lecture, he did mention that there are some nerves in the brain instead of just a bunch of neurons. But we're not really going to talk about nerves within the actual brain. We will talk about cranial nerves, which are these nerves coming off of the brain. But just know a nerve is a cord-like organ. And he said at the PNS, but then in his lecture, he said that there's some in the CNS. So just be aware of that. So if it's an organ, what does that mean? It means that it has these different types of tissues. So we know that we'll have nervous tissue. We've already looked at how nervous tissue conducts action potentials along its membrane. We're also going to have stuff like myelin, that lipid wrapper. And then what other stuff do you always have with organs? You know that we're going to need this exchange of nutrients and waste, just like we always do for organs. So we're going to have different cellular activity doing these different metabolic processes, constantly producing waste, and then they're going to need more nutrients to carry out these processes. So what's going to deliver that? Blood vessels. So we always have blood vessels. And we'll talk about these next semester, but the lymphatic system. So there's lymphatic vessels around these things. And then what's holding all this stuff together? Connective tissue. So if you kind of want to see what a nerve would look like, it's going to have a ton of neurons. So maybe I'll just draw, here's one neuron, here's a second neuron, and then let's wrap that in some connective tissue. And then if we get a bunch of neurons, we'll see this later on. Actually, we'll see this now. We'll just do this anatomy of a nerve. So we have all these neurons. And just like whenever we had individual muscle fibers, so let me draw something that you've already seen. So you should be familiar with it. So this is a muscle with these different fascicles. And these fascicles are just a bunch of individual muscle cells, these muscle myofibers. And then we extended one out like that. So if you remember, we had an epimysium, a paramysium surrounding a fascicle. And these are just connective tissue wrappers. And then we had an endomysium. So we're going to do the same thing with these neurons. So we have all these neurons, and instead let me just draw circles with lines just to make it easy. So we have all these neurons, and they each have a connective tissue wrapper. That connective tissue wrapper is called an endoneurium. And then let's switch this to looking like this. So if we have a whole nerve, and then we have a fascicle, a bundle of neurons, and then a bunch of neurons, individual neurons like that. So we're going to have an endoneurium. Surrounding a fascicle, we'll have a perineurium. And then on the outside surrounding this whole nerve is an epineurium. So these root words never go away, and they're helping us kind of figure out which of these connective tissue wrappers goes with which one. Okay, so what else do we have? We had some blood vessels in this nerve. We had some lymphatic vessels. We were wrapping all this stuff up in connective tissue. What else do we have? So we had the nervous tissue. We showed that. Blood vessels showed that, showed those. So some myelin. So we're extending those. If this is an individual myofiber coming out, then we can wrap this in a myelin sheath. So those are just some things, some components of this organ called a nerve. When we did neurodevelopment, the embryonic neurodevelopment, we ended up with a picture like this, which was our neural tube, that surface ectoderm, and then these neural crests, which are going to develop into our neuroganglion. And these neuroganglion, we'll see them in a little bit. These are going to hold our cell bodies. So when we looked at the spinal cord, whenever we drew the adult spinal cord, we kind of did this internal gray matter surrounded by white matter, and then we drew this dorsal root ganglion, and this is where sensory cell bodies are. So from our hand, we had this sensory receptor carrying this action potential all the way up to the cell body, and then we synapse in the spinal cord with an inner neuron. So these neuroganglion are what are holding our cell bodies. In this case, this dorsal root ganglion holds sensory cell bodies. We'll talk about when we get to the autonomic nervous system some different ganglion as well. So these neural crests develop into neuroganglion. So this embryonic development goes into this adult structure. Sweet. So now let's just classify some nerves. So if we have information going towards the central nervous system, that's going to be an afferent nerve. And we know that's carrying this sensory information. So we can say a sensory neuron or a sensory nerve. So it's going to be a nerve that has only sensory neurons, and that's going to, or afferent. So then we could also say a motor nerve or an efferent nerve. So this is only carrying signals away from the central nervous system. And then we can have mixed nerves. So let's say that this is my nerve, and then I have different neurons. So maybe I have sensory neurons carrying information this way, and then motor neurons carrying information this way. That would be a mixed. And then when we have our brain and spinal cord, so this is our cerebrum, cerebellum, spinal cord, brainstem, all that stuff. This spinal cord is going to have nerves coming off of it, and those are called spinal nerves. And then we'll name these later on, but these cranial nerves that come off the brain itself. Those are cranial nerves, and we'll give names to all those once we get to the motor division. All right, so we've classified some nerves. We've seen what a nerve is. We've seen the different components of this organ called a nerve. We drew some pictures. We made some connections to material that we've already seen before. We looked at this embryonic development one more time, which was at the very beginning of this central nervous system lecture, the very first lecture. Cool. And so now we're classifying some nerves and then moving into nerve regeneration. So what does it mean to regenerate?